Assalamu alaikum, everyone. You're listening to episode 156 of the Greed for Ilm podcast. If you're on Facebook or Twitter, you can follow us at Greed for Ilm. If you would like to listen to more episodes, you can go to greedforilm.com or you can subscribe to us via iTunes or Stitcher. Now, if you do have an iTunes account, I ask you a huge favor, head on over there and rate and review this podcast. I would truly appreciate that. Thank you so much. Before we get started with today's podcast episode, I wanted to first of all say Eid Mubarak to all my Muslim brothers and sisters listening to this. Thank you so much for listening, and also big Eid Mubarak to you all. And I just wanted to say that, let's keep those who died in Mecca this year around making Hajj. I think it was like over 700 people died and over 1,000 injured. Let's keep them in our du'as. May Allah accept them as martyrs. So let's definitely not forget about them. Now, this episode of the podcast, I have Dr. Jonathan Brown joining me. If you're not familiar with Dr. Brown, he holds the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Chair of Islamic Civilization and is an associate professor in the School of Foreign Services at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I have him on because he recently wrote a blog post addressing the Quranic manuscripts that they carbon dated. Now, they carbon dated these manuscripts that are, I believe, located at the University of Birmingham, and they carbon dated the parchment or the paper that the Quranic text was written on, and they dated the manuscripts between 568 and 645. So that, as a Muslim, we read this type of stuff and we just become more certain that Islam is haqq and is the truth, and we are just very pleased when you come out with that. But there was an author by the name of Tom Holland. He's also, I believe, he's a history professor, and he came out and he said that the time frame at which the carbon dated manuscripts have between 568 and 645, he believes that the manuscripts were written the earlier half of that time frame, right? So the Prophet, peace be upon him, started receiving revelation at the year 610. Right, so Tom Holland is saying that the Quranic manuscripts were written before the 610 year. So what he's pretty much saying is that the Quran predates the Prophet. Islam is, the way it exists now, it tumbles, it falls down because the Prophet Muhammad didn't, quote unquote, write the Quran. So Dr. Brown is joining me. He wrote an awesome blog addressing this whole thing. And, hope you can clarify everything for us. And if you're out there and you're doubtful, you're like, what the heck is going on, this and that, hopefully after today's episode, things will be a little bit more clear. So without further ado, Dr. Brown, assalamu alaikum.
Assalam. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to have you on because this topic, when it first came out, I remember reading it on CNN, I think, and they were saying that, it's carbon dated between 568 and 645. And obviously, as a Muslim, we're just happy. We're like, yeah, see, told you, But then Tom Holland came out and he said that this was probably, or most likely, in the first half of that time frame, pretty much saying that it predated the Prophet, peace be upon him. So I just wanted you to come on the podcast and talk about, your point of view. I want people to understand what you said in your blog post. Just hopefully clarify and clear up any type of misconceptions or doubt that people may have. So
there's a lot of Muslims, a lot of people who contribute to public discourse or sort of public intellectuals, and I think professors a lot of times they're a bit torn because their main job is to publish and teach, and when they mean publish, they mean publish academic stuff. So, that's really your main job. And certain kind of celebrity professors, or not even celebrity professors, but some professors will get pretty well known for writing kind of popular stuff or general stuff, having blogs and things like that. And it's tough because if you think about it, that's actually the most effective way to bring your knowledge to the wider society and to work as an educator and as a scholar. But at the same time, it's a bit frowned upon in a lot of in a lot of universities, and it's sort of just general university culture. It's sort of seen as a misuse of your time. But there's schizophrenia there, because in one sense, why wouldn't a university want to have someone who becomes famous? Why wouldn't a university want to have someone be a public intellectual? But at the same time, when it comes to promotion and everything, people will look to your scholarship, not to your public writing. So the reason I bring that up is, I'm very reserved about and sort of reluctant to write publicly, kind of public scholarship, in the public square. And there's as I've gotten older, I think I do so more, and now my books and stuff are more general for general audience. But the reason why I actually have written I think I've only written like 2 blog posts on my webpage, which my wife nicely made for me. God bless her. But both of them are about a response to this British scholar named Tom Holland, who's he's a classicist, and he's an accomplished classicist. He does, I think, originally Greco-Roman history. But he has really kind of made a name for himself writing popular books, public scholarship. And his most recent book, or maybe not his most recent book, came out about 2012, I think, was a book called In the Shade of the Sword. And it's about the origins of Islam. And he's a representative of a very broader phenomenon in Western, especially British American, public culture and sort of mainstream media, which is that what's called revisionist school of thought about early Islamic history gets pride of place and prioritized by American and European newspapers and journals and things like that. What does that mean by revisionist? It means people who basically, a school of thought which basically says that the generally accepted version of how Islam arose as a religion, and this has nothing to do with whether someone's Muslim or not. I mean, in general, Western scholars basically accept the overall outline for who the prophet was, when he lived, what he taught. Right? They'll debate the details of certain hadiths, whether this hadith is true or not, things like that. But in general, they say the overall structure of his life is not really questioned. The dating of the Quran is not really questioned. These things have been well established in Western scholarship. But revisionism is a school that really came into being in the late 1970s. But it's gotten kind of beaten down really severely, because it constantly gets disproven. For example, one scholar who actually died this last year, just this recently actually, Patricia Krona, a Danish scholar who was working at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies. She had written numerous books. One thing she claimed was that the Hijra dating system didn't start until much later. And then they found a rock inscription in Saudi Arabia dated to the year 13 Hijra in the Caliphate of Omar, and talking about the Caliph Omar, and with the year 13 Hijra. So you kept finding evidence that proved the claims of revisionists wrong, and so for example, in the late 1990s, I remember when I was in college, there was this Atlantic Monthly article that had a cover on a picture of the Quran on the cover, and it said, what is the Quran? And it had this magnifying glass slicing through the Quran. It said, scholars are discovering things about the origins of the Quran that are questioning everything about Islam. And it was about these documents that had been found, these very old manuscripts that had been found in Sana'a in Yemen, and saying, there was a German scholar who was saying that, these documents, these pages from early Quran copies are calling into question everything we know about the Quranic text. And then it turned out to be nothing. I mean, when people actually looked at these manuscripts, they were not any different than other mushafs. Some of them were later than people had claimed. And the one that was really early just confirmed actually that not only it was actually a Uthmanic mushaf. What does that mean? It's pages from a mushaf that comes from before the time when Uthman, the Caliph Uthman, promulgated the Quran in around 650. So, and that version, those pages aren't any different they don't have any more differences from the standard version of the Quran than there are differences amongst the various readings of the standard version of the Quran, right? So there's 7 generally not considered canonical readings of the Quran. This pre-Uthmanic Mus'haf pages, they don't really differ from what the established readings are. So basically, all that was just a bunch of noise, and in the end, it turned out to be nothing. So, but yet these things, you'll always see every year or so, you'll see some newspaper article in the New York Times or something about how someone's uncovered these early Qurans, and it's going to shed light on the origins of Islam, and scholars have to tread. Oh, I remember the Atlantic Monthly. It said scholars must tread very carefully. That's what it said on the cover. Because these crazy Muslims, they're gonna overreact, and Lord knows what's going to happen. So this stuff, it really makes me upset because, I don't, as a scholar and as someone, I went to graduate school, I got a PhD at the University of Chicago, and I'm Muslim, and I didn't force my faith on other people, and I didn't require people to accept my beliefs or expect them to consider what I believe to be true without giving them evidence that they accepted, right? So I always had to keep my faith separate from my scholarship. And then you see, people like Tom Holland or other scholars, revisionist scholars, coming and basically, in effect, ignoring evidence, ignoring what has been like the, landslide after landslide of evidence, and instead just insisting on, no, the origins of Islam are different than what everyone says they are. They have to be different. And so what upsets me is what you're saying is you are basically ignoring evidence and you're insisting on a certain perspective despite the evidence. So how is that any different than what people who are religious are accused of doing? They're accused of ignoring evidence, and not being rational, and just insisting on their version of history and their faith and their sacred history. So what upsets me is, and especially, of course, it's the revisionists who are the most snide and the most condescending to Muslims, who really have tremendous. If you read Tom Holland, I don't do Twitter because I don't trust myself to tweet, but I can see sometimes people send me things he's tweeted, and he just has utter contempt for me because he keeps saying how I'm Muslim and how I'm an apologist and how I'm limited in my view of things because I'm Muslim. I would never, but I don't say anything about him not being Muslim. I don't say that means anything about his qualifications. But if you look at who is basically taking account of the evidence in a realistic way, it's not him. It's the mainstream scholarship and the Muslim version of history that is actually the most reasonable. Sorry. So I was on a radio show with him a few months ago. I think it was during Ramadan sometime in BBC. And that was when I first, I heard him make this claim about how the 5 daily prayers were adopted from Zoroastrianism. So he basically says that sometime in the early days of Islam, like after the death of the Prophet, let's say the late 600s, early 700s, Muslims basically adopt these 5 daily prayers from Zoroastrian Persians. Now, I think that's just absurd. Basically, you're saying that the one thing that all Muslims agree upon is somehow actually imported from these non-Muslims, decades after the death of the Prophet. And so what I basically did in the first thing I wrote is I showed how even non-Muslim sources say that one of the things that Muslims do is they pray 5 times a day. So very early non-Muslims, like one Chinese traveler in southern Iraq, notes how Muslims are praying 5 times a day. And some of the earliest reports we have, Hadith reports we have, are about the 5 daily prayers. And then, so what really annoyed me was that his evidence was a 12th century book written by a rabbi living in France, okay, and recalling something that a rabbi living in southern Iraq had said in the 700s. So he's basically, one of the main criticisms of revisionists is that Muslim scholars is that the evidence that we have about early Islamic history comes from later sources. It doesn't actually come from the time of the Prophet. So they're very suspicious about sources that appear much later than the events they say they're describing. And yet, he's basing it on a 12th century text from France about some guy who's in Iraq in the 700s. And then when you look at the text that the Iraqi rabbi is saying in the 700s, he's not even talking about the prayer. He's talking about how Zoroastrians convert to Islam and then they still drink alcohol. What does that have to do with prayer? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And then not only that, but the 12th century book that he cites, it turns out it's actually a forgery done in the 1800s. So, this guy was relying on a 19th century forgery of a 12th century book from France talking about a 7th or 8th century rabbi who's talking about Zoroastrians drinking alcohol. From this, Tom Holland decides that Muslims adopted the 5 times daily prayer from Zoroastrians in decades after the Prophet's death.
Well,
how is that reasonable, right?
This guy Tom is academic. That he's
yes, yeah, of
an
course.
Academic, and pretty much, I mean, this to me, I'm a layman. The dumbest thing you can do is refer to that as being forged.
Of course, but you don't see. I mean, you don't notice. See, if you read his book, he just gives. He says, Rabbi, what's his name? Rav says that he basically says that I think it was. He says no. In the 700s says that the Zoroastrian converts to Islam bring aspects of their religion into Islam. That's what he says. In effect, I'm paraphrasing it, but that's. So you don't. And then if you look at the footnote, he cites this. I think it's called Sefer HaEshkol, this 12th century book. And so, if you're a layperson, even me, I'm not a scholar of Jewish thought. So I look at the footnote and I see this kind of interesting looking title. I don't know what to make of it. It's only when I sat there and followed up and looked at and studied everything, then I realized this is just it's a tissue of nonsense. So my point being is that, when someone's a scholar, you trust them. And that's why when you pick up a book by a scholar, you don't even, maybe as a layperson, you don't even look at the footnotes because you trust that they're doing a good job. And what he's doing in this case is really abusing the trust of the reader to manipulate them into thinking about religion in general, but Islam in particular, in the way that he wants you to think about it, which is that religions always have to be made up.
Well, when you did when you did the research and found out or whatever, I mean, as yourself as an academic, is there anything you can do to kind of show to other academics, hey, look?
Yeah, I wrote something about it and I put it up. I put it up on my my web page and my Facebook page because it's again, my concern is Western scholars, people who do Islamic history and Islamic studies don't really take this stuff seriously. Okay, so they weren't the people I was worried about because they'll look at this and they'll say this is nonsense.
So who are you working?
My concern was young Muslims. My concern was young Muslims like me 10 years ago or me 20 years ago or whatever. And reading this and because this is the stuff that gets picked up in the popular press. Like this is the stuff there'll be New York Times book review articles about Tom Holland's book talking about how great it is, and he'll get all these people in the American media talking about how great it is. And this is the kind of stuff that if you go to some cocktail party or something, this is someone's going to have read it. Mm-hmm. And this is the kind of thing Muslims are going to hear in their daily life. This is what they're going to hear from their office mates. This is what they're going to hear on TV and on the radio. And like he was on the radio show with me, right? So my point is that this is the kind of stuff that Muslims are going to come across, and it really damages their faith. They start to doubt things that they shouldn't have. They don't have any reason to doubt. If Muslims are going to doubt something, then doubt. Okay, if someone brings you good evidence, then you can doubt something, but don't doubt it based on nonsense.
I think he has.
And then,
go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. No, go ahead.
Do you think Tom Holland has? I don't know. I just the way I do it, I feel like intends to just, well, not that he just accidentally. Oh, oops, sorry.
Well, I don't. In a sense, it doesn't really matter what someone intends because you see very clearly
what the product
it's about what the product is that they're pushing. I mean, what he's pushing is a picture of Islam, which says that Islam is basically concocted by Muslims in this in the early the first couple of decades and centuries of Islam, and that it's not that none of its claims of authenticity are true, right? So it's look, Tom Holland doesn't have to believe in the Quran. No one has to do that. It's a free country. But they don't, that's not good enough. They want to show that the Quran is actually not is not this intact book that it claims to be. It's actually this book that's altered and made up later. Or same thing with the 5 daily prayers. Muslims. So, I mean, for example, we're having this conversation right now. Let's say someone writes this down and turns it into a book, and 1,000 years from now, everyone's reading this book for some reason. Okay. Now, whether or not someone likes what we're saying is not the issue, but we had this conversation. This conversation actually happened on, September 23rd, 2015. And, but someone's going to go and say, no, it didn't actually happen. It was actually a product of much later things that was then claimed to be going back to September 23rd, 2015. And just insistence that things, look, every day, there was a person named the Prophet Muhammad. He lived at a certain time. He said, he must have said certain things. He, produced this book of Revelation. And that's not an outrageous claim to make, right? George Washington wrote letters. Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. We don't have to, you don't have to go back and say that everything that ever happened in the past that means anything is made up. But this is kind of something that's insisted upon by this revisionist school when it comes to the origins of Islam. So then the second thing was when, is this thing he wrote about the Birmingham Quran pages, which, I think you read the thing I wrote. But I mean, so I don't want to, I guess the people listening can just go read it easier than me summarizing it. But basically, again, is that, he gets on the radio and he makes this really kind of confident claim in a British accent. He just sounds very educated and, very haughty, and saying, well, this really undermines, really questions a lot about the origins of Islam. And it suggests that the Quran actually might predate the Prophet Muhammad. And so you're hearing that, and you imagine just a lay person or someone, why should they not believe it? This is a respected scholar saying this. And so what I show is that the number of things you have to believe basically on no evidence in order to hold that position that the Quran comes from before the Prophet Muhammad, the number of things you have to believe are so extreme and so many that it's actually much easier just to say that the Quran comes from the time of the Prophet. I mean, which is not an outrageous claim, right? It's not. I'm not saying the Quran was, came down from heaven in, a ball of fire, and it was this golden book that was levitating around or something like that, or, it smelled like cheesecake. I'm not making it. I mean, this is just saying this book comes from the life of the Prophet. This was, even if you think he made it up, it was still made up during his, around his lifetime, or was promulgated around 650. So again, I'm not, no metaphysical claims are being made here. And yet that's not acceptable to a lot of revisionists. They have to go back and say, no, this can't be true. So the number of things you have to believe in order to accept that the Quran that these pages of this Birmingham Mus'haf come from before the Islam are so extreme that basically for me, that's a religious position. If you say his religion is about accepting things based on faith and not on evidence, not on empirical evidence, then that's what Tom Holland is asking you to do. He's asking you to believe something just because you have this unwavering conviction that the Muslims' version of their own religion cannot be true. It has to be made up. And that, for me, is dogmatic. It's not real scholarship.
So, for people listening to this, they might not. So there were a couple pages, 2 leaves, right? I saw a picture. 2 leaves from.
I think there's more than that, but I don't know. I can't remember exactly. It's not exactly clear. That again, sort of everything is coming out. Everything is based on these basically one news story.
Yeah.
Interview with the scholar in the Birmingham Library who discovered these, and I think with a librarian as well there. So everyone's basically using the same data, and it's not a lot of data. I mean, they have this rough dating that they've carbon dated the pages, the parchment that's written on from, I think it's around like 560 to 648 or something to that effect. Which is, by the way, the Prophet's lifetime is about 570 to 632. So, this is not like from the 500s. It's not from the 400s. I mean, if you insist that this parchment has to be from the very earliest part of that window, and you insist that the parchment was used right away. So you can imagine, you go to the store and you buy paper. That paper was made, I don't know how long ago, maybe a year ago, maybe 6 months ago. Who knows how long? I mean, I have paper sitting in my office from 2005, from when I printed my dissertation. So I mean, the point is that if you insist that this parchment was made in the earlier part of that window, and if you insist that it was made and then immediately used to write the stuff down, then you could say that the Quran comes from before the life of the Prophet. But that's nothing in the evidence we have suggests that at all. In fact, I give lots of examples.
Where did you get the statement you said radio in the air would whatever
Use it right away,
and then use it immediately.
No, but just again, there's no evidence for that. Like he just says that. I mean, why? Why do you look? What possible evidence do you have for that?
Yeah.
And then the evidence that other people said in defense of him is, oh, why would you leave perfectly good parchment unused? I don't know. Why would I leave perfectly good paper unused in my office for 10 years now? I use paper all the time. I don't know, because people don't use. I mean, this is your kind of early 21st century assumption that people use it immediately is, first of all, not true in the 21st century. Why would it be true in the 7th century? What evidence do we possibly, especially given, and I have an example of this, that people would all the time. We have, for example, the Swiss Articles of Federation, which are supposedly dated. They date themselves to 1291, but the scholars think that they were done written in the 1800s. But the radio dating of the manuscript, the paper that it's on, it dates the mid 1200s. So it's between 50 and 100 years. The document is between 50 and 100 years after the production of that paper. And this is just a political document. So my point is that, why should I accept that this was used immediately? You have no evidence for that. You don't even have any evidence. This is like, for example, if you said in general Arabs did this because, look, we have all these books of Arabs talking about how they produce parchment and use it, and they have a study guide and a book on how to deal with paper in books, and we see what we don't have we have no data whatsoever. There's none of that information. So you're just out of the blue saying Arabs used to do this. That's like me saying Arabs used to, scratch their ears with their pinkies. I don't know. I mean, why? I mean, I have no data for that. Why? I could claim anything I want. So, and again, absolutely no evidence. So, if you in order to, and then what I think is very interesting is that these Quran pages, these Mus'haf pages, first of all, you have verse dividers between the verses, and also dividers between surahs. And it's weren't drawn in later because you can see that the text is actually wider apart for the surah dividers and where the verse dividers are. So someone can say, oh, someone added those in later. Okay, but the text is written around to have these things in there. And what the crazy thing is that even the Muslim accounts of the Masahif, the copies of the Quran sent out by the Caliph Uthman, they didn't have surah dividers in them. So what you're saying is not only does the Quran predate the Prophet, but even the surah divisions predate the Prophet, and that then later on the Muslims didn't have the surah divisions. So you're basically saying, oh, well, they were so interested in trying to make it look like this book was their new book that they erased the surah divisions that already existed and they pretended that they weren't there, which is absurd. So everything about this Birmingham pages suggests that you have a parchment that's produced between, I think it was 560 and like 640 or something around that. I can't remember the exact dates. And okay, so I have an idea. Maybe there's a parchment that's produced during that time and then is used either during that time or a few years later to write down a copy of the Quran, which would be exactly what the existing consensus of scholars, both Western scholars and Muslim scholars, is. That's exactly what they would say. They'd say, yeah, the Quran is basically composed during the life of the Prophet. It's written down in semi-official form in the years after his death, and it's promulgated officially around 650, which would be exactly what this Birmingham suggests.
My question, when I read the article said carbon parchment itself, parchment but they didn't carbon ink.
Yeah.
Well, why wouldn't they do that?
I'm not an expert in carbon dating. My suspicion is that it's ink is tough to, it's hard to get a lot of ink. So you have to have a certain amount of material. They don't just take like one molecule to carbonate something. You have to give them a little square of paper, the size of a.
It's like giving blood. You have to fill in.
Yeah, I mean, for example, like with I think for carbon dating, like the size of something like a, I don't know, like an aspirin tablet or something. The size of a little pill. You have to have a piece about that big of the paper, and imagine you'd have to scratch off a lot of ink, and that's assuming also that the ink is it's also embedded in the paper. It's absorbed into the parchment, and so you'd really have to kind of scratch off, and then you're getting a lot of some of the material from the parchment in there as well. And of course, you'd be doing huge damage to the document. So I think again, I'm not an expert. I might be totally wrong. This is just my guess. Suspicion is that's why it's just extremely difficult to get the kind of a pure sample of the ink in a large enough quantity without doing irreparable damage to an important document.
Makes sense. Yeah, Tom didn't. Smith. They didn't have W. Smith. So I had to look.
Oh, I think that's probably some British stationery school. Yeah, but a stationery store. But I mean, the point is, okay, so they didn't have W.H. Smith. So what does that mean? That means that
they probably saved it. Right?
People didn't produce parchment, and then first of all, people reuse parchment. So one of these pages of in the Sunni Quran find that was so dramatic. The reason it's dramatic is because it's a reused piece of parchment. Parchment's treated animal skin, so people would reuse it. It's expensive, but it's not like paper. It doesn't dissolve in water, so you could actually wipe the writing off it. Mm-hmm. And so these Quran pages, they could see that there was some ink left over underneath had written it. They were able to read it with ultraviolet light or something, so they could read what had originally been written. And these were these early and just from a pre-Uthmanic Mus'haf. That's what made the Sunni pages so dramatic, supposedly dramatic. So my point is, if maybe somebody made parchment, they wanted to use it immediately, but they might have reused it any number of times.
Folks that might the Mus'haf, the Quran, the Mus'haf actually page that.
Yeah, Mus'haf. So the Quran is the actual The Quran is the actual words of the book, and the Quran is an oral document. So it doesn't. Only when you read the Quran, only when you recite it out loud, does it become the Quran. Otherwise, it's when you have something written down, it's just ink page. It's not the Quran. It's just basically a written transcription of the oral Quran. So that's why people will talk about Mus'haf. Mus'haf means a written copy.
That's why I'm burning. Right, because
you can burn Mus'hafs, exactly.
Yeah, burn the page.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Brown, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to join me on the podcast and help clarify this topic.
My pleasure.
We'll definitely be in touch, Dr. Brown. Thank you so much. Eid Mubarak and Assalamu alaikum.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Eid Mubarak.